Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk OMMA. I'm your host and agency PIO, Portia Riley. Today I'm joined by one of our lab inspectors, Kyle Cluting. Thanks for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing good.
I'm very excited to have you here. Walk me through the day-to-day of a lab inspector.
So there's really no typical day when it comes to a lab inspector. It kind of changes day by day. So one day we might be doing more of a data comparison day where we're having to grab quality control data, sample data, calibration data from one or more labs. We might be doing metric work. Recently, we've been doing a lot of research for standardization, which has to be done by June of this next year. So really, the biggest part of what we have to do is be on our toes and be ready to do whatever the specific day calls for.
I know you mentioned standardization, and I know we had a roundtable recently talking about it. Just kind of elaborate on the importance of it.
Part of the importance of it is trying to get all of our labs on the same page. Some of the biggest complaints that we get in the lab section is variance in potency, specifically data, whether that be cannabinoid or terpene potency. So part of what we're trying to do with standardization is try to get all the labs on the same page, doing a similar enough process that we shouldn't see as large variance across the state from one lab to another. As far as the specifics, our chief science officer, Lee Rhodes, he's directly working with a handful of laboratories. So they're progressing, and he's really happy with where they're at so far.
From a licensee perspective, how will this process make things easier for them?
I don't know if it's actually going to make the process that much easier from a grower or processor perspective. What it will do, though, is give them more confidence in the laboratories as a whole. If every laboratory is running a similar method, no laboratory has a quote-unquote proprietary method to have a higher potency. As far as the labs go, it will make it slightly easier for them because they're no longer going to have to defend their method because their method is going to be standardized. So ease is really only going to come down to the labs. It's going to be easier for the labs. But I do think the industry as a whole should be able to have a much better feeling about the labs once this process is done.
With talks of this, how does it feel to be involved in this conversation of trying to get this implemented in our state?
It's exciting. CSO Rhodes, he is on top of it, and I don't think we could have selected a better person to head it up. His experience is kind of unlike anything I've seen before, and he's very knowledgeable. So I'm very confident in him. One of the reasons this is exciting to me is because I have not experienced something to this scale before. I come from the environmental testing world where it is very standardized, and it's been that way for decades. There's still new and emerging technologies in cannabis, and we're still learning. I don't think I'm telling anybody anything new when I say it being a Schedule I narcotic has slowed some of the research. We are getting past some of that, but that doesn't mean we are where we would like to be or where we're going to be 5 years from now. So trying to keep up with all the new and emerging technologies has been very exciting for me, and I do think that we're doing a very good job.
With this industry still being in its early stages here in our state, how does it feel to see these new things evolve and come to?
It's encouraging because you do want to see patient safety being prioritized. That's one of the things that we do in the labs department is we always take our decisions with how is this going to affect patient health or public health as a whole. So seeing more things being put into place that will help the patients know what they're ingesting, know what they're putting in their body, that's encouraging. Also, seeing us internally attempt to do more education, that's been very encouraging as well. In my opinion, one of the most common things that you'll see is people trying to push high THC percentages. Cannabis is a very complex plant, and there's more that goes into it than just the THC. It's much more complicated than it's this amount of THC and it's going to have this effect on me. And the more of that gets out there, the more informed that patients can be in the decisions they make.
You kind of rolled right into my next question. Labs plays a major role in making sure the medical marijuana that patients are getting is safe. What all goes into that?
We have our different panels. So your marijuana should be tested for potency, both cannabinoids and terpenes, heavy metals, pesticides, residual solvents, if it is in the correct form to be tested for residual solvents, mycotoxins, and microbials. There's also filth and foreign material, percent moisture, and water activity, but those are the main ones. So those have all been analytes that have been identified as being harmful or potentially harmful. And so it's the laboratory's job to show what level those analytes are at. If a processor is going to take flour and concentrate it into a concentrate, they really need to know what levels of pesticides and heavy metals they're concentrating down. If you take a flour that is just underneath the action limit for inhalables and concentrate it down, there's a decent chance it's going to end up failing for whatever analyte it was almost failing for. So sometimes lab results are used not just for health, but also for business decisions. And if those COAs aren't accurate, that harms the businesses themselves. So it can be both patient and business related.
Walk us through a lab inspection.
Before we go to a laboratory, now that we have metric, we'll choose a set number of COAs. And what our goal is for those COAs is certificate of analysis is we are going to take them and we are going to backtrack them from the results to them being received. So we're going to go instrument to instrument, and I want the laboratory to find those results for me. We're going to go through, we're going to confirm that those are indeed the results that came off that instrument, and then we go on to the next analyte. So we'll go through that for everything, and then we go through the receiving paperwork. We also just go through general lab practices and some hygiene practices as well. I've observed an A2LA audit, which is one of the accrediting bodies our laboratories can be accredited by, and they like to describe their audits or assessments as horizontal, which means they go slightly in depth on a broad variety of topics. If they have a reason to go more in depth, they'll do what they call a vertical audit, which means we're focusing on one specific area, but we're going to go top to bottom. I like to call our inspections vertically horizontal because we're going to go deep on everything. If we have a specific area where maybe we had a complaint lodged against the laboratory that we found to be legitimate, we might spend a little bit more time in that area, but we go very in-depth on every area that we can.
We touched on the importance of testing. Are there things that people would be surprised to know?
Probably the biggest thing that people would be surprised to know is how much more testing is being done now compared to pre-metric. There could be a variety of factors that play into that, and some of it might be it's just easier for us to track now. But we've definitely seen an influx of testing, and we've also heard similar things from our testing laboratories. Not all of them, but quite a few of them have seen an increase since May, and that's encouraging. And not just in the sense that there's more testing being done, but I'm hoping that also means that more people are looking at COAs. One of the things I think is important is that everybody, whether they be a patient or a business, that they look at the COA and not just looking at the COA to see did it pass, did it fail, what's the THC percentage, what's the terpene percentage. You want to look for trends, especially if you're a business owner. Because again, going back to talking about if you have traceable amounts of heavy metals, if you condense that flour into a concentrate, it is probably going to be at a higher level. So you don't want to make a product that you can't sell. But then also that helps you identify, do I have a heavy metals problem? Do I have a pesticide problem? Am I using something that is causing a problem? So I've tried my best to encourage growers and processors to take testing not just as a final result, but also as a process improvement.
For you, what's the most rewarding thing about being a lab inspector?
Seeing the labs progress. Not every lab has had to make huge changes after we've come in, but when you see a lab that has an issue and they want help, they seek the help, and you help them through the process, that's very rewarding. And then also just kind of fostering those relationships with our laboratories. There's a total of 6 laboratory inspectors right now, and we divide all the labs equally amongst us. So we do have assigned laboratories. I try to stay as close in contact with my laboratories and their directors as they would like. I have one lab that I'll speak to every 2 to 3 weeks. If they have any sort of issue, they reach out to me because they understand that if they reach out to me with little issues, we can fix them before they become major problems. We have to follow the regulations no matter what we do, but usually following the regulations, a small problem doesn't have to turn into a huge one. I also have labs that they only contact me when they need help, and that's perfectly fine. As long as they're confident and comfortable to reach out to me when they need help, that's the most rewarding thing for me.
Lee Rhodes is our Chief Science Officer. Very knowledgeable, very passionate. I'm wowed every time I hear him talk about his background and some of these things that we've discussed today. How does it feel to have a mentor like that?
It is great to come into work every day and know that the person that is leading your team is confident in what he does and has the passion that he does to fulfill the huge task that's in front of him. What Lee's been asked to do is not easy, and he could have taken a much more hands-off approach to do it. He has decided to take the proverbial bull by the horns and lead it himself, and I think that says a lot about him and his leadership, and everybody in the labs team loves Lee, and we love his leadership, and I think he's a huge part of why the labs section is where we're at now.
I feel like we've all had that one boss that instilled something in us or said something encouraging to us that we'll take with us for the rest of our lives. What's something that Lee said to you that'll stick with you forever?
Do what you do with conviction. So don't do it halfway and do it because it's the right thing to do. It's very important to him that if we're going to do something, we do it with integrity and conviction. We've started using an acronym within our team, DICE, D-I-C-E, and it's not something that Lee came up with himself. I believe it was a different member of our team, but it's something that he has definitely run with, and we've tried to implement it in everything we do. So DICE stands for diligence, integrity, cohesiveness, and empathy. And we try to embody all 4 of those with all of our actions. So I only say that because sometimes you do have to make the decision that shows you have integrity, but it's not going to be a popular decision.
I love that acronym that you guys have come up with. I feel like that's kind of spread throughout the agency, and we've all took a little tidbit out of that.
I think that is something that we can all in the OMMA really thrive by going off of.
I think Adria said it best. We work in an entity in which we're not always going to make everybody happy, but at the end of the day, if we know we're doing what's best for the citizens of Oklahoma and the safety of patients, then we're doing the right thing.
Correct. And one thing I like to tell the labs is if you have a violation, it's not going to be based in my opinion. It is going to be based upon our rules and regulations. And I will also say that that's something that I think our labs and compliance teams as a whole embody.
We all collaborate through our different departments. Talk about that partnership between labs and compliance.
You're absolutely right. We do run hand in hand. Quite a bit of the time, it'll be A failing result will go to compliance, and then, compliance will follow up. Was this properly disposed of? Did they go through the proper channels? We've spent a lot more time working directly with compliance now that we have metric. We can see a lot more than we're used to be able to. So when we identify issues, we can send them over to compliance and let them know, hey, we were looking at a data review and we saw this as we were going through. This licensee, maybe they struggle with making lab sample packages, or they need help making reserve packages, or just anything that we see that we can reach out to people and help them with, we do try to do through those processes.
Talk about the efficiency that's led to.
I think it has really helped. And I also think it's helped bring to light, kind of like you were saying, how much overlap there truthfully is. I know that compliance has been making policies and procedures to deal with some of the stuff that we've been finding. And some of the stuff we're slightly aware of was a problem before metric. Some of them we weren't. So now it's not just, hey, we think this is happening. It's this is happening, and I can show you this number of examples. And again, a lot of the time it's not about trying to get anybody in trouble, but can we help this licensee not make this mistake? So if we see something that we do feel like we can help the licensee with, we'll usually refer that on to compliance.
Tell me a little bit about your background, what led you to OMMA, and what all goes into becoming a lab inspector.
I graduated from Oklahoma State in 2016 with a degree in biochemistry and molecular biology. After that, I got my first job out of college was a microbiologist at a biopharmaceutical company. I was doing sterility testing in a clean room environment. I did that for about 8 months, at which point I spent 5 years at the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality as an environmental chemical laboratory scientist. And there I spent quite a bit of time in QA/QC roles. I was their PT coordinator. I did a lot of PT entry. I also took an internal auditor for 17025, which is all of our laboratories have to be ISO 17025 accredited, which is just an international standard for laboratories. And then about 2020, I started seeing laboratory jobs pop up in the cannabis industry, and that was something that kind of interested me, but nothing really seemed to be a good fit. And then sometime in the summer, I saw a laboratory compliance inspector position. And after talking to a handful of the laboratories, because I was kind of trying to feel out whether I wanted to actually go into cannabis testing, I got the feeling that with my experience, I would be better served in a regulatory role. And about that time was when the laboratory compliance inspector came up, interviewed for it, got to meet Caitlin and the rest of the team, and I've loved it ever since.
Wow, science, science, and more science. That is exciting. Where did this love of science develop from?
I am a very kinesthetic person. So when I was given the opportunity in college to mess with things and not be in trouble, I ran with it. So I just kind of developed a love of being in the lab, being hands-on. I'm also a very objective-based person, which laboratory work does kind of lend itself to. So it was something where I could just go into a lab and do the work I needed to do, and I don't want to say zone out, but go on autopilot, just because that's how my mind works the best.
I feel like talking to the folks in labs, it always turns into a very interesting conversation.
It's the passion that's in our section for the patients and for the OMMA.
So this is the toughest question of all. I ask every single guest this towards the end of our conversation. What is your favorite thing to do outside of work?
Cooking. I really like to cook. I like trying different styles of cooking, different methods that I haven't tried before. I've spent way too much time on YouTube looking up different chefs and how they'll cook one recipe and look up another recipe, and just kind of like to try stuff and see what works and what doesn't.
What's your favorite kind of food to cook, and what's your favorite food?
I like putting different cuts of meat onto the smoker, just because it's interesting, all the different flavors that you can get by very small alterations to what you do. But then probably my favorite kind of foods would be like sweets and things that you can bake, which is something I've started to pick up, but I really need to not, because it is not going to be good for my waistline.
No, I completely understand that. I feel like my sister is the queen of sweets, and she introduces me to all of these different things, and I'm like, keep these to yourself. Let me be healthy and happy and stop interrupting my diet attempts. But no, I love cooking too. Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And thanks for tuning in to another episode of Let's Talk OMMA.